Thank you, Madam President. Members, racism exists. Discrimination exists. That's no secret. I've experienced it myself. I've shared it last week when we were voting on ethnic studies. That was just a very small example. I've had people ask me to change my name, to anglicize my name. I've had, we all heard about Kung Flu and how the Asian Americans are treated because of COVID right now. But none of this compares to what we all witnessed with George Floyd and continue to witness as our country wakes up to this ugly reality. I stood with my colleagues recently outside the steps of the Capitol to memorialize Mr. Floyd and make a call to action. It was an incredibly moving moment, and I'd like to thank the Los Angeles caucus and our legislative leaders for organizing that. We have a lot of work to do, and I'm prepared to engage in that work. We made history last year with AB 392, reforming use of police force laws, and we have more to do. Some of that is now being led by Mr. Gibson, my good friend Mr. Gibson in the Assembly, and I look forward to supporting his bill to ban the use of chokeholds. I supported the CSU requirement to mandate ethnic studies for students, and we still have a lot more work. But even that isn't a panacea. Racism exists, and some of it will require cultural change. Members, it was not that long ago our country and California politicians supported the Chinese Exclusion Act that put in law adverse laws specifically targeting Chinese people on the basis of race. It remained in effect until 1943. It's easy to forget that much of California's history is replete with anti-Asian racism. The Chinese Exclusion Act not only established barriers exclusively for Chinese attempting to enter the country, but it also placed discriminatory restrictions on Chinese laborers already living in the United States. We actually had laws at one point prohibiting public bodies from employing Chinese and called upon the legislature to protect the state from burdens and evils arising from their presence. It wasn't long ago that there was an entire political party created and organized around anti-Chinese racism. It was called the Working Men's Party of California. Its famous slogan was, "The Chinese must go." Their biggest leader and advocate, Denise Kearney, infamously proclaimed, "California must be all American or all Chinese. We are resolved that it shall be American and are prepared to make it so." Colleagues, that ridiculousness, that party led by that racist man held seats in this very House, the very institution we are sitting in and representing today. That racist party vigorously supported and pushed anti-Chinese laws and constitutional amendments. I won't read through all of them, but one they successfully enshrined in the state's constitution was a ban on public employment for the Chinese. It was under a section of the Constitution in which they simply entitled Chinese. Knowing this history, it makes me sad, frankly, that today this bill is rescinding very simple but powerful language from our Constitution that makes it illegal to discriminate against someone for ethnicity or race in the course of public employment. Racism is still with us in 2020. It's infuriating, it's frustrating, and it's hard to believe sometimes. And it's why so many people took to the streets in the middle of a global health pandemic. The problem with ACA 5 is that it takes the position that we must fight discrimination with more discrimination. Members, the answer to discrimination is not more discrimination. The answer is not to codify in our state's constitution the ability for our government and educational institutions to discriminate on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, color, ethnicity, or national origin. The language of our Constitution closely parallels Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In fact, Prop 209 was called the California Civil Rights Initiative. The first United States Supreme Court decision to consider an alleged violation of Title VII concluded, what is required by Congress is the removal of artificial, arbitrary, and unnecessary barriers to employment when the barriers operate invidiously to discriminate on the basis of racial or other impermissible classification. As California Supreme Court Justice Janice Brown, the first African-American woman to sit on the California Supreme Court, explained, However it is rationalized, a preference to any group constitutes inherent inequality. Moreover, preferences for any purpose are anathema to the very process of democracy. Let's fast forward to 2020. Just last week, we had a historical Supreme Court ruling protecting the rights of the LGBT community. This recent decision, a significant leap toward equality for the LGBT community, declared that a key provision of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 bars job discrimination against LGBT workers. It bars discrimination, members. That's the point. Our institutions should not embrace and celebrate discrimination based on race, sex, sexual orientation, color, ethnicity, or national origin. Let's not forget, this bill is eliminating a prohibition on discrimination based on sex, which the Supreme Court just determined encompasses the LGBT community. Let's read the California Civil Rights Initiative, or AKA Prop 209. Here's what ACA wants to jettison from our state constitution. The state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. What is so controversial about this? How did we get to a point where we are now advocating for discrimination in the law? The words affirmative action do not appear in this bill. It's about discrimination, legalized discrimination. I acknowledge the problem the proponents are trying to solve, and that's why we should be working to increase the representation of women and minorities in our public institutions. Let's look at some of the numbers. Since 1994, prior to the enactment of Proposition 209, UC freshman enrollment for Black African Americans have almost doubled. Freshman enrollment for Hispanic Latinos increased by 243%. White first-year freshman enrollment is equal to what it was in 1994. And here's a recent headline from the LA Times. UC admits largest, most diverse class ever of Californian freshmen. We have some of the most diverse universities in the country, members. Knowing this, why would we all of a sudden inject race into our enrollment process? So how do we grow equality? We need to improve our existing system and institutions. Let's look at public schools. Our public schools are letting down students in some of the most vulnerable areas of the state. Too many low-income minority students are not getting the education they deserve in primary and secondary grades. For example, 21% of African-American students who graduated in 2018 were considered prepared for college or career, compared to 52% of white students and 74% of Asian students. This is not acceptable. We owe it to these students to push for comprehensive school reforms and funding so all our students are prepared for higher education. I've fought for school reform for years, but instead of improving our schools and ensuring kids receive the best education possible, too many of us resist change. Now is the time for this change. Members, I mentioned it wasn't that long ago that we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's not that long ago we had laws that explicitly hurt African Americans. And the legacy of these laws continue with us. There are ways we can break this up. Just consider right now your zip code is the biggest determination of how good your education will be in school. If a mom in a low-income neighborhood wants to send her child to a school across town that provides a better program for her child, she's forbidden from allowing her child to go to that school. We have decades of laws, rigid institutions, and economic circumstances that determine where your zip code will be, but now your zip code determines what education you will get. This is wrong and we need to fix it. Every time a bill is introduced in this building to provide minority and low-income students with more public school options, it is resisted by too many of us, some who live in nice neighborhoods with schools they are happy with. I have to give credit to the author of ACA 5. She has tried to push for school reforms against many odds and deserves credit for that. Members, 115,000 people have signed a petition against this bill. I implore you to listen to these voices before we proceed. This bill is racing to beat the deadline to get on the ballot, but it's worth slowing down. Let's work together over the next year on how we can accomplish our goals without using discrimination as the main tool to fight discrimination. I strongly urge all of us to vote no or withhold your vote until we can come together to provide real solutions. I understand the sense of urgency, but let's do this right.